Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Urban Lunch Talk, the 50-minute city. What role does community engagement play? I'm Jennifer, and I work with communications for the Driving Urban Transitions Partnership, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. Today's Urban Lunch Talk is the second in a series of three where we deep dive into some critical issues of the 15-minute city. And these critical issues have been identified in our position paper on navigating the 15-minute city. We define these as issues that might affect the successful implementation of the concept and issues that we believe require further or more focused attention in the coming years. If you would like to explore these further, there will be a link to the position paper in the chat. And with us today, we have three of the co-editors of this paper who worked on the issues of involvement of people and organizing the transition. And these two themes will form the basis of our discussion today, where we will explore how the 15-minute city is framed and perceived by the public, the growing polarization and misinformation surrounding the concept, and strategies for co-creating with local environment or local communities to drive a more just urban mobility transition. We have a panel of experts with us who will bring their perspectives to these topics. Anna Seravalli, Annika Lundkvist, Sean Bradley, and Tim Jones. A warm welcome to all of you. But before we begin, I would just like to mention that this webinar is being recorded and we will later publish it on our YouTube channel. We will also share the recording with everyone who has joined today. I would also really like to encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the chat throughout the talk today. We will devote some time towards the end of the webinar to answer any questions. But with that said, let's get started. Our first speaker today is Anna Seravalli, who brings extensive experience in participatory planning and co-design from Malmö University. She's currently working on the DUT-funded LISTEN project. Anna, could you start by telling us a bit more about your background and work?
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everybody. Yes, so my background is I'm a designer and I'm really passionate about democratic city development. And I've spent the last 15 years here in Malmö working with questions of participation and democracy in city development. I've been working embedded both in civil society organizations as well as the municipality. And I guess with the LISTEN project, I'm trying to work in between together with another colleague. And I think it's a bit, if I can shortly describe the project, I think we are trying to stress test the concept of the 15-minute city, but also stress test some of the ideas and existing views about participation in city development.
Thank you, Anna. Our next speaker is Annika Lundkvist, who is the founder of a platform called Pedestrian Space and who co-edited the section on organizing the transition in our position paper. Annika, could you give us an overview of your work and how it connects to today's theme?
Yes, thank you for having me here and hosting this. I'm very happy to join this panel. I first heard about the 15-minute city 4 years ago, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sitting here today recovering from COVID. I had it last week, and it's very interesting. Maybe this will come up through our talk because during this time, I've been brought back to the pandemic numerous times, which is also when I first heard about the 15-minute city sometime in spring 2020. And I remember thinking, aha, this is the lifestyle I'm living. I am actually, at the time of my life, was living what I would call a 15-minute city lifestyle. So as a person who studied urbanism in my past and was quite interested in issues of pedestrian mobility, livable cities, I thought, let me take this time to start documenting what I'm experiencing, not only myself, but also my fellow, city residents, that lead to this reality, that this is not simply an imaginary concept, but that this is a lived reality for many people, or that it was, and it's something we've strayed away from. Fast forward, and I currently now live in Poland, Warsaw, the capital of Poland. I am a PhD student at the Institute of Geography and Spatial Organization, where I'm doing my dissertation research on walkable urbanism through the lens of the 15-minute city at neighborhood level. So that's been really interesting. I look forward to talking about the multiple workshops I hosted in conjunction with that later. And then, yes, also the founder of pedestrianspace.org. Please feel free to check it out. Lots going on there related to walkable urbanism. And I'd also like to share that we just recently opened abstract submissions for contributed volume together with University of Vermont Press. It will be completely open access for a contributed volume on walkability and planetary health. Check out the link for the thematic scope. And also closing at the end of this month, very briefly, is a Cities and Health special issue that I'm lead guest editing on walkability and mobility justice. All of these themes connect to the 15-minute city, which is so multidimensional. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being with us, and a lot of interesting things going on right now. Our next speaker, Sean Bradley, has hands-on experience in working with co-creation methods, and also co-edited the critical issue on involvement of people. Sean, could you share a bit about your background and work?
Hi, thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, I'm a sustainable urban designer, and I work for Groundwork London, and I'm focused on social process, social innovation, and sort of healthy neighborhood design, with a special interest in living labs. To that degree, I have been involved in Horizon projects, namely Clever Cities, doing co-creation and trying to build co-governance, and now trying to advance on those themes and looking at institutional resistances to co-creation and co-governance, and in that sort of area of work. So co-creation and co-governance are my sort of specialty, but I'm also really focused on the idea of the concept of the neighborhood, what makes a neighborhood, the relationship between the word communities and neighborhoods, which aren't exactly overlapped. And I will be sort of taking what I would call a social innovation framing to this discussion about 15-minute cities. I try to promote that, so I'll be coming from that perspective. An aside area of work, I'm a coordinator of the Healthy Communities Pathway in a UN think tank called Resilience Frontiers. So I've included some links there to all of those. And I've also included links to some of the work and to access information from Clever Cities and some publications on co-creation and co-governance. Moving towards publications that treat with the idea of the 15-minute city and the social innovation discussion. So those are publications coming up hopefully next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Even more reading tips. A lot of interesting things going on for sure. Last but not least, we have Tim Jones, who also co-edited the critical issue on involvement of people together with Sean, and who's also currently working on the DOT-funded project Enact 15-minute City. Tim, could you share a bit more about your background and work?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everybody. So I'm Tim Jones. I'm Professor of Sustainable Urban Mobility at Oxford Brookes University. I've been based at the university over 20 years now, and in that time, I've mainly focused academic work, really looking at the relationship between land use and mobility, i.e. how people get around. I've particularly been concerned with walking and cycling. So I've kind of published works mainly in that area, looking at the UK context, but also leaning in on international examples and what we can learn from examples around Europe and beyond. So one example is a book I co-published with colleagues at Lancaster and Leeds, where we looked at the barriers to walking and cycling within the UK context using quite deep immersive methods in 4 cities in the UK. Following from that, really, I've kind of moved into electric micromobility, one might call it. So electric bikes and more recently e-scooters. So I'm really interested in how they fit within not only the 15-minute city concept, but more generally in urban mobility, whether it constitutes sustainable health and mobility, for example. So I've been doing quite in-depth ethnographic work with electric scooter users and also previously electric bike users to understand their pathways into electric micromobility use, and also the public hire schemes that have sprouted up across the UK and I know are available across Europe and beyond. I guess to finish, other work I've done as well is in Brazil. I've worked on partnerships in Brazil, so the global south, to understand, completely different mobility trajectories in South America and the challenges there, particularly amongst low-income communities. So I guess the thread that runs through my work as well is that consciousness of social justice and the need for ensuring that everybody has that right to the modes of travel that governments are increasingly encouraging people to use.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for these introductions. Now let's open the discussion up to all of you on some critical issues surrounding the 50-minute city concept. And I mean, the idea of the 50-minute city has emerged as a potentially transformative concept in urban planning, aiming to create more sustainable, livable, and interconnected urban spaces. However, opinions vary. Some see it as a revolutionary concept, while others see it as just reusing traditional urban planning principles. So what is your take on the, let's say, transformative power of the 50-minute city? Would you say it's a new vision for cities or just a rebranding of long-standing ideas? And how does the current framing of the concept impact its public acceptance? Perhaps we can start with Annika on this.
Okay, thank you. I like the way you laid that out, and this is very juicy for me because I have to say both. For me, this is a revolutionary concept in that I believe the way it has been packaged is catchy and has led to the reality that municipalities across the world are incorporating it into their city plans, their city visions. And as we all know, many of our communities have strayed away from this completely. There are many communities across the world where you cannot walk within 15 minutes to get, a bag of groceries. You can't walk safely, period. That's the entire foundation, that led me to starting Pedestrian Space. That walkability should be a right within cities. It should be a foundational layer of sustainable urban development. But as we know, with our car-centric paradigms, it's not. Many people across the world cannot safely walk to do almost anything in their communities, and this is unacceptable. So I appreciate the revolutionary capacity of this 15-minute city buzzy effect. And of course, there's a lot of substance there too. There's any number of papers that's been published by the conceptualizers of the concept, Carlos Moreno, and I think it's really exciting to see all the diverse research it's also leading to. However, we have to acknowledge that it is, as I like to say, common sense urbanism at its heart. When I go back to my own personal experience as a mother at the time of 2 young kids 4 years ago, when I first heard of the term, it was literally a cartoon light bulb moment where I said, aha, yeah, this is what I've been raving about. This is what I've been telling my husband every day. I love this. I can walk my kids to school within 12 minutes. There's multiple grocery stores within, a few blocks of me. There's multiple parks. To me, that's sensible, good. That's the result of decades of good urban planning. And I truly believe we need to look to living examples and not treat this as an imaginary utopian concept. Through my work, through my developing research is also involving communicating with people to get residential narrative. so many people saying, that's what I grew up with. Also, the 5-minute neighborhood. I can't tell you how many people say, I grew up with even a 5-minute neighborhood concept, you know? In my work here in Warsaw, one of my favorite moments was hosting a workshop with a group of retired neighborhood citizens. It was their neighborhood group. Every Wednesday they got together, and I had the fortune to do a workshop with them with the help of a translator. And I asked them at the beginning, have you heard of the 15-minute city? No, they hadn't. Surprise, this group of elderly people don't sit around reading urbanism research like we do. Of course not, why would they? So I explained it to them. I had my slideshow and they said, oh yeah, that's exactly what we have here. That's why we like our neighborhood. What they experience is the result, again, of common sense urban planning. This is the responsibility of urban planners to provide this. And I think the transformative power also lies in making sure, as Tim mentioned earlier, to the social justice issue. I have a feeling that every panelist here is going to bring this up. For me, from the get-go, prioritizing spatial equity is essential. I come from a country, USA, where when I'm observing 15-minute city come up, there's a lot of fear about gentrification. So looking at the diverse geographic, climatic, social, cultural context and how it can go wrong in different areas to make sure that we're developing this, it should be something that all people get to experience, not just the privileged few. So I'm really a big fan of looking to cities where it can be said, okay, we are experiencing this mostly, as well as looking to people who are doing work to bring this alive. And also identifying when people are negatively triggered by the buzz framework of it, which I've encountered quite a bit. And so I think it's interesting too, the question was framed, what is my opinion of it? That's one thing, but also as a researcher, I'm trying to allow sometimes my opinion to be set aside and to see when people are negatively triggered by the framing, whether it's a fellow researcher or another NGO or citizens, what's bothering them about it. I know we're going to get into the conspiracy stuff later, but clearly the triggered element led to some really wild conspiracy issues and a lot of really visible, dangerous backlash. So I'm really curious how we can also mitigate that when that comes up. So those are my thoughts. I look forward to what all the other panelists have to say on that.
Yes. Does anyone have an immediate reaction? Otherwise, I'm a little bit curious about what you mentioned in your introduction, Sean. So you talked about incorporating a social innovation perspective into 15-minute cities. Could you maybe elaborate what you mean by this?
Yeah, I'm quite divided in my feeling of the term, and so I appreciate, as Annika does, that the buzzword 15-minute city is catchy and it's bringing people to the discussion and it's reinvigorating this traditional urban design. So I agree totally with that. But I think traditionally we have a long history of pushing aside hard to measure social connectivity and social factors and focusing on transport and mobility. And I fear we are doing the same thing again here. So I believe when we have to get good at describing our neighborhoods as social connectivity places where you bring social cohesion, where the social contacts and all of those things work together. So I tend to try to reframe the 15-minute city concept as like socially connected neighborhoods, or something where we're getting better at understanding how we connect socially in terms of very specific bonding techniques, in terms of how you start to recognize people's faces in your neighborhood, how you move beyond that to signaling and verbalization, and how much time you spend together, the intensity of contacts. It's all about the social contacts, and I think that also addresses some of the equity issues too. If you do social cohesion well, you can solve a lot of those issues. So for me, that's the heart of it. But I also want to say that I don't disagree with anything in specific in the 15-minute city sort of playbook. And I think I said before in another discussion that we had, that it's not, I just don't think the title of the book should be 15-minute cities. I think it should be something that should be one of the main chapters or the key chapters, but I just don't think we should frame it as as a mobility issue, because the time 15-minute cities is a mobility framing, whether we like it or not. But I'm happy to live with that. If that's what we've got for now, and that gets us closer to these types of neighborhoods, that's a step forward. So you can see I'm somewhere in the middle there. I'd actually like to hear what Tim had to say about that, because we had some long discussions before on this. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Tim, would you like to add on to that, what Sean was saying?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Annika and Sean have been saying, in the sense that, you know, this is new wine in old bottles, so to speak. And I think there's been some comments in the chat, hasn't there? Some other idioms and proverbs. Yeah, everything new is well forgotten, Martin Engelis states in the chat. Yeah, absolutely. It's nothing new, really. It's just something that's been repackaged. For centuries, you know, people have tried to coexist in a way that's easy and amenable to reproduce their everyday lives. You know, why make it any more difficult? Why plan in a way that makes life difficult due to, you know, lack of proximity to food sources, to healthcare, those sorts of things. So, I mean, I think if you ask anybody, it's kind of naturally intuitive to want convenience and ease of access to reproduce everyday life. So yeah, it is a new concept in terms of how it's been packaged. And like Sean, really, I think that we shouldn't lose sight that it's new wine in old bottles, and we should be clear on our communication, what we mean by using this kind of temporal component, thinking about time in a very loose fashion. I think one of the successes of Carlo Moreno is he's actually got people to listen and to think about proximity and beyond proximity. You know, that urban planners perhaps have failed to do, arguably. You know, I think in England we had the urban white paper around the millennium that Lord Rogers was instrumental in producing. You know, that's got many of the things that Moreno's talking about without saying 15-minute cities. But, you know, did that have the impact? I'd say it did in some quarters, but it certainly didn't have the impact that Carlo Moreno's had on an international level. So, yeah, I mean, I think, as Carlo Moreno said himself, don't read too much into the 15 as a number, be prescriptive about it. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a way to think about how we live and how we might create a better life, a good life for everybody.
Yeah, when we're on that topic of communication and what to communicate about the concept and its principle, what do you think is important to highlight about it? And is there any challenges that you see in conveying this effectively? Maybe I can loop Anna into the conversation here.
Yes, thank you. I mostly agree with the speakers before. I'm going for the challenges, because for me it's a difficult concept, and it's difficult in the sense that is both. One of the big challenges is touching on a norm, which is the car norm within society, but also I'm thinking it's a bit in this nature of being a universalist solution. This idea that this is good for all, and how it's not only perhaps a bit going away from the social, as Sean was pointing out, but also I'm thinking on the political, and thinking about that this concept is not landing in a void, it's landing in pre-existing cities, which are shaped by existing social, economical conditions, which also play a role on what does it mean to bring in this concept. And I'm making very concretely the case of Malmö, which is a city which is highly segregated. So the idea of we don't want proximity, we want actually people to move more and across the neighborhoods. So in that sense, it becomes, and also this idea of also how it connects to ideas of sustainability. I mean, we know very well that like carbon emissions are also connected to people's economic profile, social profiles. So it's also a bit this idea that, you know, this is a solution for everybody, and is it? And do we want this to be a solution for everybody? So I'm thinking it's the problem with communication. I think it tends to flatten things a bit. It's a very catchy concept, and this is maybe it's also because it becomes provocative. But what concerns me is that it flattens things a bit.
Yeah, I'd like just to comment in that I really appreciate what Anna's trying to say there when we were talking. I mean, when you're talking about designing neighborhoods from a social perspective, just like you can do from an academic perspective, you can silo neighborhoods if you don't have that balance between people moving through them and being inviting and sort of creating a ghettoized world or something like that, where we really don't want that. But you know, we have to find that balance, and that's understanding how, like I said, how these social issues are dealt with. And again, I would say how she expressed flattening. I totally agree. That's what we're doing, or we're risking doing. So we're gaining traction, we're gaining publicity, but are we losing depth of thought and really trying to the richness of what richness and complexity of what a true functioning healthy neighborhoods and communities would be in the different contexts, you know, both because I spent 15 years in Brazil, so I know that world as well, and how we're talking about the informal way that neighborhoods rather than formal. So there's just other pathways that we have to be aware of, and this concept is you know, doing both good and maybe some bad.
Yeah, it's really a complex concept, or maybe perhaps to grasp. I saw also in the chat saying, yeah, it's good for people working with urban planning, but what about the general public that might not be thinking in these terms? And I think we also mentioned in the introduction a little bit about the controversy and the polarization. And I mean, the concept has been celebrated by some people, but it has also sparked really heated debates and a lot of conspiracy theories. And in Oxford, for example, we have seen a huge backlash after a local council approved traffic filters, I think, which fueled a lot of misinformation and led to protests. And Tim, you're based in Oxford and seen this polarization firsthand, perhaps. Why do you think is behind this controversy? And yeah, why has the concept become so polarizing in places like Oxford in particular? And maybe also, can I add, there's a lot of questions in here, maybe more broadly, how can we address these conspiracy theories and resistance to concepts like the 50-minute city?
Okay, I'll try and address that complex question. So I think there's two levels of activity going on, right? Okay, so we've got to remember we've had a general election, we've got a new government in place now, so it's very, very different sort of terms and conditions, if you like. And the previous government really played on what's called culture wars, you know, and identity politics, and really pitching different groups against one another, almost as a distraction from the kind of macroeconomic issues that are facing people. So that's kind of one major current, I guess. And then at a local level in Oxford is a city that has obviously got its constraints with its river, with its you know, really quite compact urban form in the centre and world-renowned university, and lots of challenges in providing space for people to move around. And for those who have visited, you'll be well aware, just walking around the city on a weekend is kind of quite difficult in the summer period, with tourists, students, residents all competing for space. It's very, very difficult. Also, this city obviously over time has developed such that all the planning ideas through the eras are manifested on the ground. So we have more low dense neighborhoods as you come out of the city. Although it's compact, it's kind of from the center to the edge, it's probably what, 3 to 5 kilometers roughly. You know, arguably it is a 15-minute city as it is, at least by bicycle. It can be challenging in terms of the quality of infrastructure, which was designed in the modern era, if you like, 50s, 60s, around car use. And then we had the 80s policies of liberalisation, land use liberalisation. So we've got quite a few box developments around the ring road, you know, big supermarkets, And as one research participant said to me the other day, well, you know, it's hardwired into us now, isn't it, to get our shopping, to drive out to the supermarkets, to bring it back and load our fridges for the month. That's just the way society's gone, and that's just the way it is. In his, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, but that was his. So you can see that. Sorry, the other dimension I'll add is possibly what's called the town and gown as well, where Oxford is regarded by some as a division of those that go to the university and are catered for within the centre and can live their existence almost totally in the Oxford city amongst its old buildings, and then those on the outside that service those colleges, those universities, and also work in the BMW factory and the NHS facilities around the inner edge of the city and on the edge of the city. So you've got that complexity. Now, what's happened is obviously the council's trying to think about how it reaches its net zero targets, and has got quite not stringent but quite ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions and transitioning to net zero. Okay, and also boosting its walking and cycling in the city. Cycling's quite healthy, but relative to Northern Europe, it's quite low, but relative to other cities in Europe, Cambridge aside, it's quite high. So they're trying to build on that and capitalize on it. Final thing to say before I go on to the protest is we've also gone through 14 years of austerity in the UK, where local authorities have been hollowed out. So they're really trying to do things with less human resources and also less capital resources. So that also creates a challenge. And the systems are set up such that councils have to bid for money and compete with other councils to obtain that money. They have to argue the case for why they should be awarded money to, say, put a kilometre of cycle route in. So there's a competitive bidding process as well. So it's very piecemeal in terms of, you know, a grand plan to just put in what you want. We've had COVID, of course, the lockdowns, so that's generated whole conspiracies around that. I would argue that the culmination of the protests in February 2023 are a culmination of, you know, people's legitimate concerns about the idea of the 15-minute city and the low traffic neighbourhoods. That is, the barriers that have been put in place to stop cross-town traffic or running through neighbourhoods. You know, legitimate concerns around what will it mean for me, or I've got to buy a permit this, I've got to do that. But also thinking back to what I said earlier about the culture wars perpetuated by the former government, I'd say it was hijacked also by the far right and also right-wing media outlets that have fanned those flames and actually built it into a bigger narrative about conspiracy theories, world domination, curtailments of rights, you know, a reduction in quality of life, or quote, as the campaign group behind it, Not Our Future, says, a new dark age. Okay, so really dystopian view. Now, for some people who potentially have received that information and can't untangle it, you know, that's quite a lightning rod and fuel on the fire of things that they already feel aggrieved about, that might not be nothing to do with 15-minute cities. It might be about economic situation. It might be broader macroeconomic issues that I've spelled out earlier, austerity, etc., that build on that. So all of that created a powder keg, if you like, for that protest. I think I suppose to finish, I'd say that was February 2023. We're now at the back end of 2024. Speaking to other people and doing research on the ground, I do think the against is overstated. I do think there's a vocal minority that have used these new media channels to overinflate the issue. So that's not taken away from people who've got legitimate concerns. Indeed, I interviewed a person yesterday with mobility impairments that have got, you know, issues with some of the design, but they're kind of things that could be worked through. They're not global conspiracy theories. But I'd say that has reduced. I certainly think, I can't reveal data from my research that I've done with communities, but I can say that leans towards identifying that people are actually happy with some of the things that have happened, or the main thrust of the local low traffic neighbourhoods. They are leaning towards being happy with that, if I can put it in that loose phrase. whilst there are concerns, it isn't anywhere near the magnitude that one would believe from looking at some of the media outlets or some of the kind of conspiracy or right-wing think tanks.
Has anyone else had a similar experience from their work? Yeah, Annika, you raised your hand up.
Sure, I can jump in here. And I also want to say, to start off with, lest we forget that the conceptualizer of the 15-minute city, concept, Carlos Moreno himself went through a period of receiving threats of violence for the work he was doing. And I don't know about the rest of the panelists or those watching, but the day that I'm doxxed or my family is threatened because of my work with sustainable cities is the day I'm going to consider, potentially hanging my head up. It's very scary to consider. So as I understand, all of that activity died down, but it's very concerning. It's extremely concerning. And I believe researchers pooled together and created petitions also to say we need to protect our researchers when they face these types of situations. However, I agree with, I believe, Tim, what you just said, that it was potentially a very, very vocal, aggressive minority that was sort of flaming things up to make it seem that it was more than it was. I experienced it myself on my platforms. I post about the 15-minute city a lot. There was a distinct shift at some point where I was getting comments. And, one of the most concerning for me, there's multiple concerns, but I saw in the chat, somebody commented, Martins Engels, also about how it reached Latvia, Riga, Latvia. They are bringing ghettos back. This reference to ghettos was, for me, one of the most concerning about the conspiracies that rose up. My understanding of ghettos, being quite different than what is intended by a 15-minute city, this idea that people would be trapped, and the dismissal of real urban poverty, real ghetto situations, and the fact that, at least where I come from, talk about segregation, talk about ghettoization. People in these communities, often the most deprived, have the least proximity to services. The injustices are enormous. Imagine being among the most deprived in your city and you have reduced access to affordable food deserts, reduced access to clinics, reduced access to quality green space, because all of that goes to the privileged community. So for me, again, coming back to spatial equity, this idea of the ghettoization is something that I'm always happy to talk about and put front and center and say, let's dissect this and do some surgery, because it's, to me, highly inappropriate. I'm really glad to see the conspiracy talk on that come down a little bit. And I feel that actually an aggressive response is sometimes needed, not to mention reporting such comments. For example, throughout social media, I think sometimes people feel they need to justify everything that comes in and say, let's deal with it. Some of it's really inflammatory and deserves to be reported on those platforms. And that's something that we've sometimes done when we see activity. So I think the issue of how to deal with the conspiracy is, to me, also really surprising. Who would have seen this coming with the 15-minute city, that we would be dealing with such intense conspiracy language around this? Yes, I see that too in the comments, the ghetto metaphor very much related to Jewish ghettos here in Poland too. And we saw that happening on social medias throughout my interviews with people working in municipalities. They brought up how it was a very vocal minority bringing up the relationship to Jewish ghettos. Being a North American, it's interesting for me because where I come from, ghettos is something else. But I always want to come back to the spatial equity issue, and that 15-minute cities should not be something that we're exploring for the privilege, but also to consider what are the urban poor to say experiencing, what are marginalized communities experiencing in terms of proximity. Often they're suffering the worst in terms of proximity to services and amenities.
Some really interesting points. I see we have some hand raised. Anna.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and thank both Tim and Annika for their reflections, because I think one of the reasons why maybe especially this concept is becoming kidnapped, it's also because it's easy to kidnap. And this is what I meant before with this flattering, because it look at transport and this idea of proximity without relating to other aspects that are connecting to the way we live in the cities. And just bring this example of this guy I recently interviewed. Let's call him Frank. So he's originally from Iraq and has been in Sweden for 20 years right now, and he's running a repair car service. It was not a conspiracy theorist, but when we started to talk about the 15-minute city, he slightly panicked, both because cars it's everyday bread, but also he mentioned, yes, and then I need, every day I bring my daughter to school and I bring her 10 kilometers away from our neighborhood because schools here are not good. And if I can't have a car, if we move towards this idea that the city there is less cars and it's more difficult to move by car, what does that mean? So to me, it's a bit, it's a bit a way also, how do we bring back attention to the issues, underlying issues, perhaps of social justice, and what does it mean to have a good city or a human city or a city at human scale? It's not just about distance, it's also the quality of the services we can offer to citizens.
I think that also adds on to, we had a question in the chat on the okay, I can't say this word. Is it feasible to have all the services within the 50-minute city? We have to start there. How does the city actually look like today? And is it feasible?
And do we want that? Do we want that?
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Also in cities where we have diverse groups and communities, do we want them where do we want them to meet and in which ways?
Yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I like that expression, the idea that, yeah, it's a concept that's easy to kidnap. That's why I would go back to the idea, if we start to frame it more as socially connected neighborhoods, it's harder to argue with that. But then add the layers. So like I said, a socially connected neighborhood is that balance between cohesion and openness, and then you have to obviously communicate that well. So again, a social framing, good communications, and then sort of co-creation and decentralizing the decision-making so that people can express it so communities can start to express how they want to live at that stage, and understand that these transitions take time and different communities will be on different timelines. And I still think we can identify from the concept some lighthouse ideas that we can mostly agree are positive, but if communities have to choose those and decide upon them themselves and collectively work in those directions, then I think you solve a lot of the issues, which would be sort of what we're going to talk to later. But there's always this idea then of diversity. Even when you talk about, when I say socially connected neighborhoods and cohesion, there's people who want to live quite anonymously in cities. So you always have to design in diversity and different ways of living and understanding different ethnic groups and cultures, and just so that's really important. So the diversity, but there is we do anonymous quite well in our cities right now. We do have a lack of cohesion, and I think if we ask communities to where they want to go, they would like to be more connected to their neighborhoods. It gives more safety, and there's lots of evidence that that's positive. But then the last point would be, again, the speed of change. If you are going to talk about removing cars and stuff like that, coming in and radically changing things will be inflammatory usually. It usually has to be quite subtle. We're talking about adaptation. Cities, we should have the patience to do this over decades, literally, and give people the time to choose their pathways and evolve, rather than come down with any sort of heavy-handedly. That's how I would argue that we have a psychological grounding. It's not interesting to have your neighborhood transform totally and then there's nothing there as a reference to the way you lived before or something like that. So there are some interesting issues there.
Yeah, interesting points, and it's surely important to get people on board that's living in these cities. And I think we can turn now to the critical role of community engagement. What would you say that co-creation with citizens play in shaping a just urban mobility transition? And perhaps how can we move between just mere consultation and ensure that we actually have genuine participation in planning processes? Perhaps you can share some examples of co-creation from your projects. See, Tim, you're currently involved in the Enoch 15-minute city project that has a lot of co-creation, and you have a workshop planned. Maybe you can share shortly on how you're planning to engage with citizens in these workshops.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I guess the first thing to say is, like, I'll be clear on my position on this, really. And I want to kind of tie this in what we talked about earlier about conspiracy theories and polarization, because I'm aware that, for example, one charge by the far right and conspiracy theorists is they say that academia and science has been politicized. Okay, so I'm an academic, and I think it's my duty to give my position on what I feel about subjects. It doesn't mean to say, because I'm, human, right? I'm not an automaton that's got no opinion. I had not been through any cultural filter, so I have got values, right? So on particular positions on particular things, I think it'd be untruthful to say I haven't. Okay. However, that is able to be untangled from my approach to doing research. I'm able to do that with integrity, robustness, validity, reliability, trustworthiness, all of those principles. So that for me is an affront to my profession if people are saying that I've been corrupted in my duty in terms of what I do. So in terms of engagement of the public, then my position on that, really, my intuition on that is that I get the sense that the public in many respects want government, the authorities, states, just get on with some things. They don't need to be consulted. They don't need to be engaged in it. I'll give you an example. Road potholes is a curse in the UK. The government, I believe, has just pledged some money to try and deal with the backlog. But I don't think we need to consult, quite frankly, with people about whether it's a good idea to fill potholes. I say that in jest, right? But obviously there are other things, such as concepts of 15-minute city, that have a major impact in how people live their lives or move, or even where they live, actually, as somebody's alluded to with the gentrification issue. So of course it is really, really important that we engage the public in that and that ongoing debate, not more so than to dispel some of the kind of myths that are created around the 15-minute city. That dialogue is critical. That the need to kind of, provide answers to questions and to actually fact check some of the things that are being brought forward that aren't actually true is really, really important. And then in terms of where the 15-minute city focus is channeled in each city or place or neighborhood, of course, it's really important to involve the public in co-creating and thinking about what that vision for the neighborhood or for the city is. Okay, I think that goes on certainly in the UK sense at a certain level. Maybe we could use the word engagement and consultation, which is some level of getting feedback on proposals that have been put forward by the experts. But of course, there's that next level, a deeper level of really trying to understand what people's attitudes and motivations are behind their behaviours and their desires for their particular domain. So the way we're doing that we've got a project called Enact 15-Minute City. I think a link was put in the chat for those that want to have a little look further. So we're working with partners in Norway and Trondheim, and Spain, Valencia, and Poland, Gdansk. Then we've got our case study in Oxford. We're using an urban living lab approach. So that's basically what I mean by that is an experimental approach where we work with the community to think about what the 15-minute city means, where it's come from, how their neighborhood has developed over time, why that was, what's influenced that, and where it might be going in the future. Okay, and then for them to play a part in co-creating that future. On a practical level, how are we doing that with the resources we've got available? We're going to recruit a panel of 12 citizens from the neighborhood. So we're going to put a call out for interest. We're then going to be really transparent of how we've selected those 12 diverse participants for our panel. And then we're going to lead a series of workshops in the community, a space that they're comfortable to visit, to get them to talk about, to have a dialogue around the 15-minute city and what it might mean for the case study neighbourhood that we're looking at in East Oxford. We're also introducing like some sort of talks about that. For example, in East Oxford, it's got a very interesting history about how the neighbourhood was planned and how it unfolded. There's kind of social dimensions to it. As Anna's saying, it's not just the technocratic, physical and transport. There's also the social dimensions about who comes to live there, why are they there, how did that happen? So we're kind of looking at that by channeling in some of the historical events, such as the rent strike that went on in the neighbourhood back in the 60s and 70s, I believe it was. So we've got an expert talking about that. We'll also look at things like the streets and patterns. Why are they designed as they are? Was that a global conspiracy, or was it kind of careful thought going into how we distribute traffic in and around Oxford, you know, since the 50s and Buchanan's traffic in towns? So we're going to give that foundation a sense of understanding and acknowledging that not everybody is focused on why things are the way they are, to try and get a grounded understanding of that, and then to think about the way they could become in the future and the challenges to achieving that. The final thing I'll say is we are also using a bit of novelty. For some, it won't be novelty because, you know, technology moves on, but we're also introducing augmented and virtual reality in that as well. So by that, I mean, people will be able to engage using tablets that we'll give them, or cell phones, and actually walk around their neighborhood and visualize how that could change. And that could be macro things like land use changes, you know, the provision of local shops and services, through to kind of micro level details, drop curbs, that sort of thing that is obviously very significant to people's mobility. Yeah, so we're kind of doing that. And I think, of course, that is just one thing we're doing, but it's more about the process of understanding people's understanding of the 15-minute city, and then channeling their energies into how we get to that that transition and what it means for them in place.
Thank you, Tim. It will be interesting to hear the outcomes of this and see what happens in the ENACT project. Sean.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce then the idea of changing the lead framing concept of our communities and our neighborhoods, the subdivisions of a city, how you aggregate it into smaller cohesive parts. Because for me, for example, the co-governance concept in terms of what are the numbers of people, if you're part of a neighborhood or a borough that's 100,000 people, you won't feel part or able to influence the decisions. And there's, you're a drop of water in an ocean at that stage. If you get the numbers down to 10,000 people in a community that has some decision-making power, those are the framing elements. I think proximity and the access and car movement, I said, those are fantastic sub-elements that are critical to, that work hand in hand with that. But we're talking about, governance ideas. And then again, recognition. How many faces can you recognize? How many people? Again, 100,000, you become anonymous automatically. When you're down to 10,000, 5,000, 6,000 people, you start to have a sense that you're walking down the street that I know a few people. I recognize that face. It gives you a sense of safety. So the design on multiple levels. So there's the concept of communities. We have virtual communities now, but one of them should be physical and visual in component, and that connects you into your neighborhood. But again, we need diversity, people who want to find that more anonymous spot in the neighborhood. So it's not one size fits all. So, building social connections. And then we were talking about the viability. Again, the population, we have no idea what a good neighborhood, there's no consensus over that, but that has to do with, like I said, how many shops can survive. If you have, that pushes the number up. If you're towards, you want to have some more cafes and things, 2,000, 3,000 people can't support a lot of coffee shops and grocery things. So the numbers, for each situation, there'll be a design looking at all these factors. And then again, the non-siloing aspect. If you do decentralized decision-making and co-governance, which we're focusing on now, you have to have good vertical connection between different levels of decision-making. You can't just decentralize and say, okay, communities will decide everything. And as Tim said, not everything needs a group of people to be talking about it. Some things are just, you know, the more important and impactful it is, the more people should be discussing the issue. So in Clever Cities, we work strongly in co-creation, and we were able to, for important ideas, get community talking about where projects should happen and the budgets and that level of involvement. And we separate that out between deep engagement and wide engagement. Deep engagement meaning a smaller number of people in the community were able to be there for all the meetings and multiple meetings, and they actually got salaries to participate in that process, and to stand on equal footing with technical people. But it was a mix of technical and community visions, and then you have wide engagement to involve larger community people to a lesser degree. So all that is a process that can be designed, yeah, I think we need to think about it with that framing, that social framing again.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. We're running a little bit out of time, but I see that your hand is also raised, Anna. Maybe you can weave in and a do and a don't and a recommendation, so we can slide over to that part. But I would like to finish off to, if you can share a do and a don't recommendation to our listeners when working with co-creation and participatory planning.
Yes, a don't, even if it's not a don't, there is no such a thing as citizens. There are different groups, different communities. If you want to engage with them, you cannot consider them as one entity. You need to go in and understand. And regarding the co-governance that Shane was raising, we are also working with this model here. And I think we talk a lot about involving marginalized groups, but we have to remember that groups are marginalized because someone else is in a privileged position. So how do you work both with empowering or making space for marginalized groups, but maybe also start to questioning who is in a privileged position and how is this privilege being created? Because if we talk about social justice, this is what it's about. It's not just about, you know, going out and talking to the people, is also questioning who is in a privileged position. And this might include also planners. We know if we want to move towards sustainable cities, we need to bring together expertise and knowledge from everybody. And this means also that planners maybe need to step back sometime and learn from citizens and from different groups of citizens.
Good tips, Anna. Annika, shortly, can you share a do and a don't?
Okay, one do, I would say definitely seek local allies. This is for NGOs, planners, etc. I think that's pretty common sense, but I've learned through my workshops just how critical it was to have local allies to provide space for workshop, help with translations, etc. It's amazing how many people are there to help. About don'ts, just to wrap up my real philosophy with the 15-minute city too, and I'm also happy to move to other framings. But one thing I see a little bit is this idea that if we have 15-minute cities, people can't then move. This is one of the biggest conspiracies, and nowhere in the 15-minute city framing are we saying people have to stay in that neighborhood. For me, this is also an equity issue that maybe people who want to be fluid across expansive metropolitan districts can do so. But if you go to a humble neighborhood park, you know, on a Sunday afternoon in the summer, you will see often elderly people, disabled people, and people with young children. This idea that everybody has the privilege to move widely across the city, to me, doesn't address issues of spatial equity and that services are needed on the ground. I'm seeing this firsthand as well now, recovering from COVID, that the benefits of being in a literally 5-minute neighborhood, I would say, gives my husband the ease to take over completely household, you know, care for our children, popping out to the apothec for me. If I were a single mother, you know, this would be invaluable, priceless to have those amenities nearby. I don't want to have to go 45 minutes just to get to a, you know, pharmacy. So one don't, I would say, is be very careful about looking at the 15-minute city as something that traps us. It's fluid. It only means more services for diverse residents on the ground. And also one don't, I would say, don't get beat down by negative comments. If you're a person that's managing an NGO or a planner or a district authority and you get the conspiracy stuff bubbling up on threads, don't get beat down by that negativity. Find a way to report it or address it in a way that makes you feel comfortable. Maybe seek out others who might have also had that challenge of dealing with the negativity.
Thanks, Annika. Tim, super short, one do and one don't.
It'll be super short because Annika's picked up on many things I was going to say. So I'll throw in two more then. So do, I think, humanize the 15-minute city, right? Tell the stories, share the information about people's lives within the 15-minute city. Those can be bad as well. Yeah, I think it's important to take on stories of challenges people face, but always looking for solutions to how that can be improved. Don't, I'm going to say this now, it's my area, don't leave it to the transport planners, okay? It's not a technocratic solution. It's not solely about transport planning. It's not a technocentric solution. It needs to be community driven, as we've said, deliberative, democratic, and part of a wider set of initiatives. So Anna gave that illustration of somebody about the car mechanic and schools. Obviously, there's schools policies that can have an impact on 15-minute cities. There's social policies, social care policies. So all of those domains need to be hooked in and not left solely to the planners and transport planners. And I say that without disrespect to those professionals, of course.
Thanks, Tim. And lastly, Sean, a short do and a don't.
Yes, do understand that every urban intervention is an opportunity to build connections for social cohesion, for continual community capacity building, strengthening of people's confidence in themselves and what they're capable of doing, and in, you know, decentralized democratic processes. Don't be rigid in determining what is co-creation in each neighborhood and cultural context, as each is on their own trajectory. Just be clear that moving towards positive change is at your own rate and your own sort of cultural rate is fine. Just, you know, find the speed that's good for your community.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for your time and participation today. Special thanks to our guest speakers. It has been very interesting to discuss this with you. You will find the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, and there should be a link in the chat to that. If you're interested of hearing more about the 15-minute city, we do have one more episode coming out later in the fall. And we also have an Agora dialogue that my colleague shared also in the chat, where we invite experts in to have input on our roadmap update. So please have a look at that and see how you can contribute to it. But thank you everyone for today, and I hope to see you all soon in an upcoming Urban Lunch Talk.